Hello everybody, and welcome to this sixth and final video of Merfolk Joe's Guide to Modern Merfolk. This video will discuss all the lands in the main deck of Modern Merfolk and the typical roles they play. As with my videos on the deck's creatures and non-creature spells, my remarks here are not meant to be comprehensive nor definitive. If you would like me to expand upon any point or have any questions, please leave a comment. Before I begin, I'd like to direct any of you who haven't already seen it to my video discussing the land Seagate Wreckage and its possible role in Modern Merfolk. In that video, I discussed data I collected across 100 games that led me to conclude that 20 lands is preferable in Modern Merfolk to 19 lands. This is a hotly contested point among Merfolk players, but I ask that you watch the video in order to better understand my point of view. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at these 20 lands. There are two main dynamics at play while assembling the mana base for Modern Merfolk. First, the balance of blue sources versus colorless sources, and second, the balance of basic lands against non-basic lands. The first dynamic of the balance of blue sources versus colorless sources is absolutely central because Merfolk is a mono blue deck and as such requires timely access to blue mana. However, our dependence on blue mana is, to a degree, mitigated by the inclusion of 4 Ether Vials. This handy artifact makes it very reasonable to run a full playset of Mutavaults, despite their inability to produce blue mana. Cavern of Souls is another land that is involved in this dynamic, but I'll discuss that land more in a moment. The second dynamic, of the balance of basic islands against non-basic lands, is somewhat less fundamental than blue versus colorless, but is still very important to get correct. Too many islands in any deck makes it vulnerable to strong hate cards like Choke and Boil, and having too many islands makes any deck very weak to Merfolk by giving them access to Island Walk by default. The prevalence of Choke in particular as a sideboard card, and the increasing prevalence of Modern Merfolk suggests that playing fewer basic islands should be a goal when composing our mana base. Playing fewer basic lands obviously requires playing more non-basic lands, but this isn't a problem for Modern Merfolk, as the only card in the format that really punishes non-basic mana bases is Blood Moon. But Blood Moon is terrible against any Merfolk mana base because we simply always run too many basics for Blood Moon to be of any consequence. I discussed Blood Moon in relation to Modern Merfolk in another recent video, which I encourage you to watch. With these two dynamics in mind, let's now discuss each different land in the deck. First, the basic island. As with any deck in Modern, it's essential to play some minimal number of basic lands to be able to grab when an opponent uses Path to Exile or Ghost Quarter. This minimal number of basics tends to be anywhere from 1 to 4 for decks with greedy mana bases such as Red, Green, Tron, and Jund. These are the types of mana bases that get wrecked by Blood Moon. Merfolk, however, as a mono-colored deck, is the opposite of greedy. We can comfortably run all the non-basic lands we like and still end up with 7 or 8 basic islands rounding out the mana base. Since, as I've already mentioned, 20 lands is the number I consider optimal, I've ended up with 8 basic islands, balancing out the 12 non-basic lands that I consider essential. 8 basic islands is more than enough to ensure we always have a land to grab off of Path to Exile or Ghost Quarter, and certainly more than enough to ensure that Blood Moon is virtually never a problem. Moving on to the non-basic lands, I'll begin with the playset of Wanderwine Hubs. The existence of this land is a boon to mono-blue Merfolk decks as much as it is to blue-white Merfolk decks, the reason being, again, that we want access to as many non-basic blue sources as possible. And as far as such lands go, Wanderwine Hub is nearly perfect. As a non-legendary land, we can comfortably run a full playset. And with 50% of the deck being Merfolk, we virtually always have one in hand to reveal to bring the land onto the battlefield untapped. In the exceedingly rare instances where we do not have a Merfolk to reveal, odds are we would not need the mana that turn anyway. Next, we have our 2 legendary lands, Oboro, Palace in the Clouds, and Minamo, School at Water's Edge. As with Wanderwine Hub, the primary reason for including these non-basic blue lands in Modern Merfolk is to play around Choke and Boil, and to keep our opponents off of Island Walk in the mirror match. Unlike Wanderwine Hub, however, these legendary lands can only be comfortably included as single copies, rather than in multiples. Also unlike Wanderwine Hub, these lands have abilities beyond their mana production. Oboro is, far and away, the more powerful of the 2 lands. The ability to pay 1 generic mana to return it to our hand is useful in a number of situations. First, if we want to protect the cards in our hand, we can pick up Oboro in response to non-targeted discard effects, such as Liliana of the Veil's +1 ability and Kolaghan's command's discard mode, and throw the land away rather than our valuable spells. Second, in the event that we're stuck with only Oboro and a Mutavault on our third turn, we can tap Oboro, floating blue mana, then tap Mutavault for colorless mana to pay for Oboro's bounce ability. After the ability resolves, we can replay Oboro as our land for the turn, and tap it for a second blue mana in order to cast one of our many double blue 2-drop creatures. Minamo's ability is far less useful. The most powerful thing it can do in Modern, and it only comes up very rarely, is to break the shield of an opposing Kira Great Glass Spinner. Oboro's ability will be countered by Kira's ability, which then allows us to kill or bounce the Kira with a single spell rather than having to spend 2. Next up, I'll discuss Cavern of Souls. This land allows us to cast our Merfolk without fear of counterspells. Now, because counterspells in Modern are relatively weak, Cavern of Souls is far stronger in Legacy, with cards like Force of Will and Daze to worry about, and is run as a playset in that format. Still, there are enough decks playing Remand, Monolith, and Cryptic Command in Modern to easily warrant the inclusion of 2 or 3 Cavern of Souls. Again, we do want a good number of non-basic blue sources in the deck. However, because Cavern of Souls cannot produce blue mana for anything other than creature spells, it can be very clunky when run as a full playset. With 4 copies in the deck, we too often don't have access to blue mana when we want to cast Spreading Seas, or Echoing Truth, or any of the blue instant spells in our sideboard. One pointer on how to most effectively use Cavern of Souls is to keep it in hand as long as possible against control decks. I'll go through the first few turns of an example game to demonstrate this technique. We're starting this game on the play, and have the option of putting a Cavern of Souls, Basic Island, or Wanderwine Hub into play as our first land drop. Since we won't have to play through any counter magic this turn, we should not play Cavern of Souls yet. And playing a Basic Island first would give our opponent access to Island Walk if he was also playing Merfolk. With no information on the opponent's deck, we should lead here with our Wanderwine Hub tapped. Revealing a Merfolk from our hand at this point is not worth bluffing Spell Pierce or Vapor Snag, because the opponent is going to make their turn 1 play, regardless of whether we actually have these spells or not. For their turn, the opponent leads with a Basic Island of their own and resolves a Serum Visions, then passes back. We draw Spreading Seas to the turn, which is obviously not very useful at this point. Again, since the opponent doesn't have mana available for any counter magic, we should go ahead and play our we should go ahead and play an island. After casting our creature, we pass back to the opponent. Note that if the opponent had not played Serum Visions on their first turn, but instead left their Basic Island untapped, we should have played Cavern of Souls here on our second turn in order to play around Spell Snare. The opponent untaps and draws. At this point, the options he has in hand for his turn are a second Serum Visions or a Monolith. Being on the draw this game, he risks falling very far behind in tempo if I get to resolve a second creature next turn. And Monolith makes the most efficient use of his mana this turn. So decided to hold up mana for the counterspell, the opponent goes ahead and plays an untapped Watery Grave, going down to 18 life in the process, and passes the turn back to us. We untap and draw Silvergill Adept for our turn. Now, in the face of open mana, we should finally deploy our Cavern of Souls, name Merfolk, and cast our Mirror Regery. Though it may not appear so to relatively new players, this is a very big blowout. By keeping the Cavern of Souls in hand as long as possible, we caused our opponent to pay 2 life for an untapped Watery Grave, and, more important, we caused them to entirely waste their second turn. Had we played the Cavern of Souls earlier, the opponent would have certainly cast the Serum Visions on turn 2. However, we effectively baited their counterspell and got hugely rewarded. Last but not least, we have the only truly colorless land in the deck, Mutavault. While its inability to produce blue mana is a serious drawback, Mutavault more than makes up for its shortcomings by contributing an enormous amount of flexibility, synergy, and positive tempo to the deck. Mutavault's activated ability, for the low cost of 1 generic mana, allows it to become a base 2/2 Merfolk Elemental, which, in conjunction with Merfolk Lords and Master of Waves, is often our largest creature on the battlefield. It enters the battlefield untapped, and so can contribute mana right away, or act as a blocker immediately on the opponent's turn as necessary. It can also gain Island Walk, just like any of our other Merfolk. Because of all these strengths, Mutavault should always be included as a full playset. Let's compare Mutavault's efficiency and versatility to other popular manlands such as Raging Ravine and Treetop Village. While these lands are certainly very powerful and have proven themselves time and again in tournament play, the fact that they always enter the battlefield tapped is a massive drawback that can lose games when mana or a blocker is needed immediately. Yes, Mutavault's base power and toughness is less than both of these other manlands, but Mutavault benefits from all of the synergies in the Merfolk deck and is often bigger, faster, cheaper, and more evasive than either of these powerful lands. Mutavault is one of the biggest payoffs for playing this particular tribal deck. Yes, we limit ourselves to playing only Merfolk creatures, but the benefits derived from the tribal synergies more than offset this limitation. This concludes the 6th video, where we have looked at the deck's lands. And, as the last video in the series, this also concludes my guide to Modern Merfolk. I hope you have found the information useful, and I wish you good luck and fun times piloting this wonderful deck. As always, please leave any comments or questions you might have, and please subscribe if you enjoy my videos. Thank you very much.